Good morning. Welcome back to another week here on Joe Sends Rarest Photos. It is Monday morning. Had a great birthday weekend. Thank you for your kind birthday wishes and the messages, emails, all that you've sent me. There were some super thanks that came through as well. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, thank you for that. So let's get to reading, okay? Thank you to your subscribers, members, everybody that's been a part of the channel for a long time. Those that are buying the shirts and sweatshirts and mugs and all that stuff below. If you haven't seen it yet, go below and scroll through that. I tried to get the MITT up, hadn't been able to get that up yet, but there is the Prissy bobblehead and or Priscilla bobblehead, and Prissy B should lose a Presley name, merchandise below. All right, let's get to reading. We are on page 11 of this book, Dolores Hart. What a wonderful book this is so far. Okay. When Dolores was 2 years old, Bert and Harriet separated, the first of many partings in their turbulent union. Those 2 years had been frustrating ones for Bert, who drifted from one meaningless job to another, increasingly fearful that fame and fortune would elude him. He began to drink more and more heavily, and was as abusive to his wife as his father had been to his mother. But his brother remembered Bert had to get drunk to be cruel, as her father was cruel as sober. At one time or another, Dolores' paternal aunts all witnessed violent outbreaks, with Harriet running, screaming from Bert's attacks, sometimes carrying tiny Dolores in her arms. Harriet did file for divorce, charging cruelty. Before it was granted, however, the judge called the couple into his chambers and effected a reconciliation. He wrote up a code of conduct that both the 18-year-old wife and 19-year-old husband had to sign. Convinced that the paper was a good foundation for future stability, the judge dismissed the suit. Well, the story made the Chicago newspapers, which printed the agreement. That's embarrassing. Under the terms of the code of conduct, Bert had to attend church voluntarily for 1 year. Number two, both had to agree not to run to their parents to settle future domestic problems, but number three, allowed Bert's lawyer to act as arbiter of any dispute. I guess that's a sign of the times back then. Not very equality there. The well-intentioned judge code would not ultimately save the marriage, nor would it end Bert's violence towards Harriet. But the fresh start was benefited by Bert's getting a job as a commercial model, something for which he was suited. He posed as the attractive suitor, admiring the soft hands of the beautiful girl in magazine ads for Jergens lotion. He filled the same role in ads for Lady Esther, For-Purpose face cream, and Truchet hand lotion. He also began appearing in the popular photo-illustrated romance novelettes, featured in women's magazines such as McCall's and Good Housekeeping. Now, these photos dramatized scenes from the stories. They were not a particularly impressive showcase, but Bert had achieved minor star status, which fed his ego. And the jobs brought him into contact with a lot of pretty and available girls, which set him on the road to chronic infidelity. He basked in this attention and no longer minded having to take the occasional regular job when he wasn't working as a model. Pretty interesting. While Bert was moonlighting as a soda jerk at the Aragon Ballroom, a job he took as a way of meeting influential people, he was discovered by the Chicago-based talent scout from Metro Goldwyn Mayer. Definitely the matinee idol type at 6'2", Bert bore a striking resemblance to one of the studio's biggest stars, Robert Taylor, especially with the mustache he grew at the talent scout's request. Well, 30-something Taylor was about to depart MGM for the Army. Presumably as a 21-year-old replacement for him, Bert was tested and signed by MGM to a stock player contract. Now, in the days when studios had stables of actors under contract, it was a usual practice to keep their stars in line by having a similar and often younger type in the wings. James Craig was MGM's threat to Clark Gable. Warner Brothers had Dane Clark for defense against John Garfield. Cherie North, in her blonde bombshell period, was signed by 20th Century Fox when Marilyn Monroe was misbehaving. Rarely did any of the threats go beyond just that, just a threat. Bert Hicks would not prove an exception. In his first year under contract, he did bit parts in 4 MGM movies before the studio dropped his option. Well, almost immediately, he was signed by 20th Century Fox, and he appeared in a walk-on with Betty Grable in Sweet Rosie O'Grady before World War II interrupted his career. Well, he joined the Army Air Forces, and took his training at Shepherd Field in Texas. In 1943, Broadway's Moss Hart wrote and put into production the U.S. Army Air Force's Winged Victory, which followed a group of air cadets through the training and the nightly raids in Germany and Japan. Now, a call went out to Air Force servicemen who had been actors to fill the cast. When the show opened in November of 1943, the cast featured 209 members of the armed forces, including future stars Carl Malden, Edmund O'Brien, Red Buttons, Don Taylor, Gary Merrill, Barry Nelson, Lee J. Cobb, Kevin McCarthy, and Peter Lind Hayes. 2 of those, Malden and Taylor, would work with Dolores a decade and a half later. Private Bert Hicks had a small part in the play, and a close buddy, Alfred Arnold Kokazzi, nicknamed Freddie, sang in the chorus. Malden and fellow cast member Phyllis Avery remembered Bert as being gregarious and fun, but also an irresponsible actor. He would miss performances, and without his wife and child near, most of his free time was spent drinking and womanizing. Winged Victory became the mega hit of the 1943 Broadway season, winning critics and audiences alike. Now, when the show closed in May of 1944, Bert brought his buddy Fred Kokazza home to Chicago to meet his sister Betty, whose photo had taken Freddie's fancy. So Bert brought Freddie Kokazza home to meet his sister. Okay. He was a hefty man with a voice that had been compared to Enrico Caruso's, and wasn't shy about showing off his talent. This is something that Dolores Hart wrote. In fact, he used to sing so often and so loud that Granny once told him to shut up when he all but shattered her wine glasses. Aunt Betty, however, was more than impressed. Aunt Betty was in love. So did they make wine glasses a lot thinner back then? Or is this just basically one of those examples of somebody that can sing high or really loud, and the frequencies can shatter a glass? Just curious. I'm sure you would think they would make them thinner these days to save money or to make the quality less. I don't know. Alright, the entire cast of Winged Victory transferred to the screen when Bert's home studio, 20th Century Fox, made the movie version in 1944. Bert's role barely survived in one scene. Directed by George Cukor, the movie is the typical patriotic, sentimental fare of the war years, but its cast includes 5 future Oscar winners: Malden, O'Brien, Buttons, Judy Holliday in her film debut, and Cukor, who would also be one of Dolores' future directors. Bert Hicks might have been starring in movies if the war hadn't interrupted his career at Fox. After the war, the return of Henry Fonda, Tyrone Power, and Victor Mature shoved Bert back to stock player status, acting in B-movies and appearing opposite aspiring actresses in screen tests. But his name popped up with regularity in the columns, usually preceded with the words heartthrob or sigh guy. Harriet was always supportive of Bert, subordinating her own dreams of a career to his. Now, after she and Dolores joined Bert in Los Angeles, she committed herself to making the marriage work, hoping that Bert would change. Bert's infidelity was, of course, beyond Dolores' comprehension. It wasn't until she was in her teen years that Harriet confided to her that her father had been unfaithful during their entire married life, is what Dolores had said. And here's a nice little section of Dolores talking. I remember the fights, the yelling, but I don't think I really connected them with the bruises I would often see on my mother. I remember, too, long periods of silence and waiting for the next explosion. It always came, but as violent as he would get with my mother, my father never lifted a hand at me. He never struck me or even said a cross word to me. I was never afraid of him, said Dolores. I always knew that he loved me and had a sense of pride in me, but I don't remember Daddy being a constant presence in my life. We did have happy times as a family, especially when things were going well for him at the studio. Most of those memories are centered on trips to the beach. Both my parents adored the ocean, Mommy especially because she loved looking tan. They would pack me and my new favorite toy, Bulgy, a huge pop-eyed red rubber little whale who had replaced Panda in my affections, in the rumble seat of our second-hand car. And off we would go for a day at the Santa Monica Beach. Now, while Mommy and Daddy sunned and swam, I was literally kept under wraps because I would sunburn in 5 minutes, says Dolores. Happy, though, wasn't the right word for a life. Frantic would be more like it. It seemed like we were always running to get somewhere, as if we could keep ahead of the threatening undercurrents. Those undercurrents, Aunt Shirley remembered, reached a violent climax when her brother struck Harriet with such force that he broke her jaw. She was hospitalized and finally bowed to the fact that she was married to an unstable, sadistic man. She made the decision to separate for good, and fearful that Bert might come to the house when she wasn't there and take Dolores, Harriet sent Dolores to Chicago to stay with Grandma and Grandpa Cood until the situation was finalized. This is Dolores again. The only problem was I had to go alone. Granny would be at the Chicago station to meet me, but for the 3-day journey, I was on my own. Well, not really. Mommy made arrangements with one of the porters, a big black bear of a man, to take charge of me. You could do things like that then. She bought 2 seats so I could have room to sleep, and sewed a label on my coat with my particulars, identification, destination, and into whose hands I was to be delivered. I didn't like having that sign on me, but I wasn't in the least frightened. It was another adventure. Even so, I was sad. I knew that Mommy and Daddy weren't going to live together anymore. That had to be, I don't know how old she was back then, but had to be frightening for a young girl to travel on a train alone. You know. Dolores' visit to Chicago was cut short with the announcement that Harriet had once again reconciled with Bert. And wanted her child back home, a request that Esther granted very reluctantly. The reconciliation ended almost as soon as it began. There wasn't going to be another one. Harriet filed for divorce again. This time it will stick, she vowed in a newspaper interview on the divorce, borrowing a phrase usually identified in Hollywood with reconciliation. Now, with no peddling judge to intercede, this time the divorce was granted. It marked the end of the marriage, but it would not be the end of the relationship. Harriet may not have had success as a wife, but she could be a friend for life. Harriet and Dolores moved to an apartment on Reeves Drive in Beverly Hills. The 1-bedroom and kitchenette was soon shared by Aunt Betty, who had relocated to the West Coast to follow her boyfriend, Freddie Kukaza, who was now pursuing a singing career. So this is Dolores talking now. Betty was my love when she lived with us. She had beautiful black eyes and shoulder-length hair that bounced when she walked. She was one of the best playmates I ever had. She tried to be stern, but whenever I didn't obey, she would scoop me up and throw me, fully clothed, into the bathtub and turn the water on and shriek with laughter. I bet Aunt Betty was drinking a little bit as well. But somehow, no matter what, Mommy and Aunt Betty did, I felt lost and uncertain. Divorce, remarriage, and redivorce left me angry. Not unwanted, but lonely. I remember Mommy bought a picture and hung it over my bed. It was a picture of a small boy carrying a large round globe. She told me it was Jesus, and the globe he was carrying was the world. And I thought to myself, that's not the world. That kid just has a fancy basketball. Still, I would stare at the picture, maybe out of a real desire to believe, and little by little, I wasn't so alone. If that kid could carry such a burden, well, maybe I could too. Bert would come back on numerous occasions, always uninvited and usually drunk, presumably to see Dolores. Harriet would complain that he came back just to quarrel with her, but she would always let him in. If he'd been drinking, she would put Dolores in the bedroom and close the door. Dolores says right here. When he would come back, he was awful to Mommy. She never said anything bad about him to me, but I could see she was afraid of him. Aunt Betty, who was always sided with my mother whenever Daddy was around, said she thought that I was a remarkably well-adjusted little girl, in spite of the fact that my family life had not been a good environment. It was the first time I had heard that word, environment. I didn't know what it meant. Must be something awful, I thought. On our first Christmas Eve alone, Daddy came by dressed in a Santa suit and very drunk. That's a fly that just trying to walk on the camera there. No matter what I do, it's just one of those fly seasons. Got the trash can down by the road and, anyways. I've listened to all the suggestions, the cups of water and the fly strips, but these are smart Tennessee flies, which is unusual. All right. So on our first Christmas Eve alone, Daddy came by dressed in a Santa suit and very drunk. Mommy wouldn't let... Sorry. I'm just thinking of some of the comments about how y'all think that there's flies in your house because there were flies in that last video buzzing around the camera. Sorry. All right, so he came by dressed in a Santa suit and very drunk. Mommy wouldn't let him in, so he stood outside banging on the door, yelling and singing Christmas songs. He was making such a fool of himself in front of the neighbors that she was more embarrassed than frightened. She grabbed me, put me in the bedroom, and opened the front door. Fortunately, Betty was there. For once inside, Bert's holiday boisterousness turned menacing. Dolores could hear him bullying her mother, while both women tried in vain to reason with him. She crept out of the hiding place and saw Bert holding something in his hand that was, I should say, sharp. I won't say the word. Threatening to use it on Harriet. Betty was trying to take it away from him when the 6-year-old child, crying, spoke to her father. This is what Dolores Hart said. I told him to give Aunt Betty what he was holding because what he was doing was not good. Well, Bert listened to Dolores. But the row continued. Clapping her hands over her ears to shut out the ugliness, Dolores hid in a closet and wrote a short letter to her grandmother. Can I come live with you? This is not a good environment for a little girl to be in. That concludes chapter 1 of this book. Chapter 2 is coming up in a day or two. I'll keep reading. I just wonder if there's any pictures in here. There is. So I'll show a few pictures here. Some great little photos there. I know the text is probably going to be backwards. That's how it works on this thing, but you can see the photos of Dolores there. So there's a movie called Lisa. Huh. That's pretty. There's some more pictures here. Looks like she played a nun in one of her movies too. Where the Boys Are. No, that's not it. Having never been outside the United States, I wanted very much to do Francis of Assisi because of its Italian location. I played St. Clair to Brad Dillman's St. Francis, and we became lifelong friends. All right, thanks for joining me today. I got to get to work. I didn't get up as early, so I didn't get a chance to read as long. But it's something, right? And I'll see what I can do to come back later on and maybe get an episode of Child Bride in, okay? TCB TLC, this is Joe Sims for Elvis Photos. Till next time.